The flames crackled like gunshots in the night as Pearl Nelson stumbled through the smoke-filled cabin, her baby clutched desperately to her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but she couldn't leave without the locket, her mother's final gift before Pearl had set out west from Boston 3 years ago. It was 1876 in Jamestown, California, and Pearl was about to lose everything she had built since her husband's death. The wooden beam crashed down mere inches from where she stood, sending sparks flying like fireflies against the black canvas of night. Pearl shielded her 6-month-old daughter Emma with her body as she lunged for the small metal trinket resting on the mantel. Success turned to terror as another beam fell, catching her leg beneath its burning weight. A scream tore from her throat, primal and raw, as she twisted to keep Emma safe above the flames. With strength born of desperation, Pearl pushed the beam away just enough to drag herself toward the door, the pain in her leg blinding. The cabin was collapsing around them as she crawled across the threshold and onto the dirt road outside, her baby wailing but miraculously unharmed. "Hold on," she whispered to Emma, her vision blurring as she crawled farther from the inferno that had once been their home. "Mama's got you. We're going to be fine." But Pearl knew they weren't fine. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, her leg was badly burned, and the cool October night would soon turn frigid in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. As consciousness began to slip from her grasp, Pearl heard the thunder of hooves approaching. She curled her body around Emma, a final protective gesture as darkness claimed her. Blake Turner had been riding back from a late delivery to the Hollister mine when he spotted the orange glow on the horizon. As a cattle rancher whose property bordered the forest, fire was his greatest fear. He'd spurred his horse toward the blaze without hesitation, praying it hadn't reached the dry pines beyond the creek. He hadn't expected to find a woman and child lying in the dirt road, the cabin behind them already half consumed. Blake leaped from his horse, kneeling beside the unconscious woman. Her breathing was shallow, her dress singed, and her lower leg badly burned. The baby in her arms, remarkably, seemed unharmed though terrified, her tiny face red from crying. "Madam," he called, gently shaking her shoulder. When she didn't respond, Blake made a swift decision. With careful movements, he gathered both mother and child in his arms, whispering, "You're both safe now," as he settled them securely against his chest. Though the woman couldn't hear him, the baby's cries quieted at the sound of his deep voice. Blake mounted his horse with practiced ease despite his precious cargo and turned toward his ranch 3 miles away. The doctor would have to be fetched, but first, he needed to get them somewhere warm and safe. As his horse carried them through the moonlit landscape, Blake looked down at the unconscious woman's face. Even smudged with soot and twisted in pain, he could see she was beautiful. More importantly, she'd clearly risked her life to save her child, the kind of courage he'd always admired most. "Don't you worry," he murmured, not sure if he was reassuring the baby, the mother, or himself. "I'll take care of you both." Pearl surfaced slowly from unconsciousness, the pain in her leg a throbbing reminder of what had happened. Before opening her eyes, she reached frantically for Emma and found nothing but soft quilts beside her. Her eyes flew open as she tried to sit up, panic flooding her veins. "Emma," she cried, her voice hoarse from smoke. "My baby." "She's right here, madam," came a deep, gentle voice from across the room. Safe and sound. Pearl turned toward the sound, wincing as the movement jostled her injured leg. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood near the window, her daughter cradled expertly in one arm. Emma was contentedly grasping at his finger with her tiny hands. "Who are you?" Pearl demanded, her maternal instincts overriding any sense of gratitude or decorum. "Where am I?" The stranger approached slowly, as if recognizing her fear. In the morning light streaming through the window, Pearl could see he was perhaps 30, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt, and a face weathered by sun but handsome in a rugged way. "Blake Turner, madam." "This is my ranch, the Broken T, about 3 miles from your place." He carefully transferred Emma to her waiting arms. "I found you both outside your burning cabin last night. Dr. Simmons has been by already to tend to your leg." Said you were lucky the burn's bad, but with proper care you should heal without too much trouble. Pearl clutched Emma close, tears of relief springing to her eyes as she examined her daughter, not a scratch on her perfect skin. Thank you, Mr. Turner. I don't know how to repay you. No need for repayment. Anyone would have done the same. He cleared his throat. I'm afraid your cabin is gone, though, nothing left but the chimney stack. The full weight of their situation crashed down on Pearl's shoulders. No home, no possessions beyond the nightgown someone had put her in and the locket. Where was the locket? Her hand flew to her throat, finding nothing. Seeing her distress, Blake reached into his pocket. Looking for this. It was clutched in your hand so tight I had to pry your fingers open to clean the soot off you. He held out the silver locket, and Pearl took it with a trembling hand. Thank you, she whispered. It was my mother's. Figured it must be important for you to risk your life going back for it. There was no judgment in his tone, only understanding. Pearl looked down at Emma, now contentedly grasping at her mother's hair. I got Emma out first, but I couldn't leave without this. It's all I have left of my family from back east. She didn't add that it contained a tiny portrait of her late husband, Thomas, who had died of fever before Emma was born. I understand holding on to what matters, Blake said simply. He moved toward the door. I'll bring you some breakfast. You need to keep up your strength if you're to heal properly, Mr. Turner, Pearl called as he reached the doorway. I don't mean to impose, but where will we go now? Blake turned, his expression softening. You and your little one can stay here until you're well enough to make plans. I've got plenty of room, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Fairchild, will be scandalized by the arrangement but happy for the company. A small smile lifted the corner of his mouth. Rest now, Mrs. Nelson, Pearl Nelson, and this is Emma. Rest, Mrs. Nelson, you and Emma are safe here. After he left, Pearl sank back against the pillows, her mind racing despite her exhaustion. She was at the mercy of a stranger, her home and possessions destroyed, with a baby to care for and no immediate prospects. Yet beneath the fear and uncertainty, she felt a flicker of something unexpected gratitude that of all the people who might have found them, it had been Blake Turner. In the kitchen, Blake found himself moving with unusual care as he prepared a tray for his unexpected guest. Mrs. Fairchild wouldn't arrive for another hour, and his ranch hands were already out with the cattle, so he'd taken it upon himself to tend to the injured woman and her baby through the night. Emma had been surprisingly easy to care for, accepting the goat's milk he'd warmed and falling asleep against his chest, while he'd maintained his vigil by her mother's bedside. He'd never spent much time around babies, but this one seemed to have decided he was trustworthy. Her mother, on the other hand, had yet to make that determination. Blake could read the wariness in Pearl Nelson's eyes, and he respected it. A woman alone with a child had to be careful, especially in these parts where the law sometimes felt more like a distant concept than a reliable protection. Blake arranged a plate of fried potatoes, eggs, and bacon on the tray alongside a cup of coffee. As an afterthought, he added a small jar of preserves and some bread. She'd need her strength to heal. When he returned to the guest room, he found Pearl attempting to get out of bed, her face white with pain. "Whoa there," he said, quickly setting down the tray and moving to her side. "Doc said you need to stay off that leg for at least a week." Pearl looked up at him, frustration evident in her expression. "Emma needs changing. I can't just lie here while she's uncomfortable." Blake hesitated only briefly before saying, "I can help, if you'll show me what to do." The surprise on her face might have been comical under different circumstances. "You change a baby's diaper? I've mucked out stalls and tended to sick cattle. I reckon I can handle a little one's needs if you'll direct me." He kept his tone matter of fact, not wanting her to feel embarrassed. After a moment's consideration, Pearl nodded, pointing to the small bundle of items he'd retrieved from the cabin before the fire had consumed everything. "There are cloths in there, and a bar of soap." Under her instruction, Blake managed a passable job of cleaning and changing the baby, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the tiny girl. When he finished and handed Emma back to her mother, Pearl's expression had softened considerably. "You've done that before," she observed. Blake shook his head. No, madam, never had cause to. My brother has 3 young'uns up in Sacramento, but I haven't seen them since they were Emma's age. You're a natural then, she said, settling Emma beside her on the bed. Most men would sooner face down an angry bull than change a baby. Most men are fools about what constitutes real work, Blake replied with a slight smile. He gestured to the tray. You should eat while it's hot. As Pearl ate, Blake found himself studying her more carefully. In the daylight, he could see that her hair was a rich auburn, currently tangled and singed at the ends but clearly once beautiful. Her eyes were a clear green, intelligent and direct when they met his. Though too thin, perhaps she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of good breeding. If you don't mind my asking, Mrs. Nelson, how long have you been in Jamestown? He asked as she finished her meal. Pearl dabbed at her mouth with a napkin. Almost 3 years. My husband Thomas and I came out from Boston after the war. He'd served in the Union Army and wanted a fresh start. A shadow crossed her face. He died of fever last winter before Emma was born. I'm sorry, Blake said quietly. That can't have been easy. No, she agreed, but we women do what we must. She glanced down at Emma, now sleeping peacefully beside her. The cabin was paid for, and I've been taking in mending and laundry from the miners. It was enough to get by, her voice faltered. Now I'm not sure what we'll do. Blake considered her situation. A widow with a baby, no home, likely few resources. The obvious solution would be for her to return east to whatever family might remain, but something told him Pearl Nelson wasn't the type to retreat. You've got time to figure that out, he assured her. For now, focus on healing. A knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Blake excused himself and returned moments later with Dr. Simmons, a gray-haired man in his 60s who'd been tending to the residents of Jamestown and the surrounding area for decades. Good morning, Mrs. Nelson, the doctor greeted her warmly. I see you're awake and alert. That's excellent. I'd like to check that leg, if you don't mind. Blake discreetly took Emma and stepped outside to give them privacy. As he stood on the porch with the baby in his arms, gazing out at the rolling pastures where his cattle grazed, he wondered at the strange turn his life had taken in the span of one night. He'd gone from a solitary existence, focused entirely on his ranch, to having a woman and child under his roof. Mrs. Fairchild arrived while he was still contemplating this change, her eyebrows shooting up at the sight of him holding a baby. Mr. Turner, what on earth? There was a fire at the Nelson place, he explained quickly. Mrs. Nelson and her daughter will be staying with us while she recovers. She's injured her leg rather badly. The housekeeper's expression immediately shifted from shock to concern. The poor dear, and the baby, is she all right? Emma's just fine, Blake assured her, somewhat surprised at how naturally the baby's name came to his lips. But Mrs. Nelson will need help for a while. Her cabin's completely gone. Martha Fairchild, a widow herself who had worked for Blake since he'd purchased the ranch 5 years earlier, clucked her tongue sympathetically. Well, it's a good thing you found them. I'll take care of everything they need, don't you worry. Blake handed Emma to the housekeeper with some reluctance. He'd grown oddly attached to the little one overnight. I should check on the men. Doc's with Mrs. Nelson now. As he saddled his horse a few minutes later, Blake found himself glancing back at the house repeatedly. It had been a long time since he'd felt responsible for anyone other than his ranch hands and livestock. He wasn't entirely sure what to make of the protective instinct that had awakened in him, but he knew one thing: for as long as Pearl and Emma Nelson needed sanctuary, he would provide it. Over the next few days, Pearl struggled with being confined to bed. Used to hard work and self-reliance, she found it difficult to accept help from Blake and Mrs. Fairchild, though both offered it without hesitation. Emma, on the other hand, seemed to thrive in the new environment, especially when Blake was around. Much to Pearl's surprise, her typically fussy baby would calm instantly in the rancher's arms. She's got good taste, Mrs. Fairchild remarked one afternoon while helping Pearl bathe. Mr. Turner's the finest man in these parts, though you'd never hear him say so. Pearl wasn't sure how to respond. She'd noticed Blake's kindness, his gentle way with Emma, and the respect his ranch hands showed him. She'd also noticed his broad shoulders, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, and how he seemed to fill a room with his presence without ever raising his voice. These were dangerous observations for a woman in her position. "He's been very kind," she said carefully. "I don't know what would have happened to us if he hadn't come along when he did." Mrs. Fairchild helped her into a clean nightgown one of the housekeeper's own, as Pearl had nothing left. "Mr. Turner's always been one to help where needed, but I've never seen him quite so involved before." She gave Pearl a knowing look. "He checks on you and little Emma at least 10 times a day when he's not out with the herd." Heat rose to Pearl's cheeks. "We're an imposition. He probably just wants to make sure we'll be leaving soon." The older woman snorted. "That man has never minded an imposition in his life if it was the right thing to do, and he lives in this big house all alone, has since his father passed and left him the place. Could use a woman's touch if you ask me." "Mrs. Fairchild," Pearl exclaimed, scandalized. The housekeeper merely chuckled as she helped Pearl back to bed. "Just making an observation, dear, just making an observation." Later that evening, Blake himself brought dinner to Pearl's room. He'd taken to doing this each night, claiming it gave Mrs. Fairchild a chance to get home before dark, though the housekeeper lived in a small cottage just behind the main house. Pearl suspected he simply wanted the time to visit with her and Emma, a suspicion that both worried and warmed her. "Mrs. Fairchild says you tried walking today," he said as he set the tray across her lap. The meal looked delicious: roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread. "Just to the window and back," Pearl admitted. "I'm going stir-crazy in this bed." Blake sat in the chair beside her, automatically reaching for Emma, who lay awake in her makeshift crib, a drawer lined with soft blankets. The baby cooed happily as he settled her in the crook of his arm. "Doc Simmons said you need at least another 3 days before you should be putting weight on that leg," he reminded her. "Burns are tricky. They can seem better on the surface but need time to heal underneath." Pearl sighed, cutting into her beef. "I know, it's just, I need to start making plans." "I can't impose on your hospitality forever." Blake was quiet for a moment, watching Emma grasp at his finger. "I've been meaning to talk to you about that," he said finally. "I sent word to Sheriff Davis about the fire. He came out to look at what was left of your place." Pearl tensed. "And he doesn't think it was an accident, Pearl." It was the first time he'd used her given name, but she barely noticed, alarm shooting through her. "What do you mean?" Blake's expression was grim. "The fire started from outside, not from your stove or fireplace. Someone set it deliberately." The fork clattered from Pearl's fingers. "But who would?" She stopped, a sick feeling growing in her stomach. "Do you have any enemies? Anyone who might wish you harm?" Blake asked, his voice gentle but serious. Pearl thought of Everett Whitmore, the banker's son who had been pressing his attentions on her since Thomas died, growing increasingly angry at her rejections. But surely even he wouldn't go so far as to burn her home, knowing Emma was inside. "I can't think of anyone who would do such a thing," she said, but her voice wavered. Blake studied her face. "You thought of someone just now." Pearl hesitated, then told him about Whitmore. "But it seems extreme even for him, and he knows I have a baby." "Some men don't consider consequences when their pride is wounded," Blake said, his jaw tightening. "I'll have a word with the sheriff." "No." Pearl reached out instinctively, her hand landing on his arm. "Please, I have no proof, and if it was him, confronting him might only make things worse." Blake looked down at her hand on his arm, and Pearl quickly withdrew it, embarrassed by her forwardness. But instead of being offended, Blake captured her hand in his much larger one. "Pearl, someone tried to harm you and Emma. I can't let that stand." The protectiveness in his voice stirred something in her that Pearl had thought died with Thomas. She looked away, confused by her own feelings. "I appreciate your concern," she said quietly, "but I need to handle this myself when I'm back on my feet." Blake seemed about to argue but nodded instead. "All right, but promise me you won't try to confront anyone alone." "I promise." Pearl met his gaze. "I have Emma to think of. I won't take unnecessary risks." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, perhaps, or something more. Whatever it was, it left Pearl breathless. Blake gently settled Emma back in her makeshift crib. "Eat your dinner before it gets cold," he said, standing. "I'll check on you both before I turn in. After he left, Pearl found her appetite had disappeared. She pushed the food around her plate, her mind racing. If someone had deliberately set fire to her cabin, what did that mean for her future in Jamestown? And what would she do now, with no home and no means of supporting herself and Emma? More troubling still were her growing feelings for Blake Turner. She had no right to them, not when she was dependent on his charity, not when she had a child to consider, and certainly not when she had nothing to offer a man like him. Yet as she lay awake that night, listening to Emma's soft breathing, Pearl couldn't help wondering what it would be like to belong here in this house, with this man who had saved them both from the flames. Blake sat in his study long after the house had gone quiet, nursing a glass of whiskey and staring at the ledger open before him without really seeing the numbers. His conversation with Pearl kept replaying in his mind, the fear in her eyes when he'd mentioned the fire being deliberate. The way she'd withdrawn when he'd offered to help, the brief, electric moment when she'd touched his arm. He'd never considered himself a man quick to form attachments. After his disastrous engagement 8 years ago, when his fiancée had left him for a banker from San Francisco just weeks before their wedding, Blake had focused solely on building his ranch into one of the most successful in the county. Women had occasionally caught his interest, but none had held it for long. Until Pearl Nelson had literally fallen into his life, her courage and determination evident even as she lay unconscious with her baby protected in her arms. A knock at the study door interrupted his thoughts. He was surprised to find Mrs. Fairchild standing there despite the late hour. "I thought you'd gone home," he said, setting aside his glass. "I was about to, but I wanted to speak with you first." The housekeeper entered without waiting for an invitation, a habit formed over years of service that was more familial than deferential. "It's about Mrs. Nelson." Blake straightened. "Is something wrong? Is she in pain?" Mrs. Fairchild's expression softened at his obvious concern. "No, she's resting, but I've been thinking about her situation." "As have I," Blake admitted. "She'll need work once she's healed, and a place to live." The housekeeper fixed him with a pointed look. "I could use help around the house, especially with the extra mending for the ranch hands. And there's that small cottage on the east side of the property that's sitting empty." Blake considered the suggestion. The cottage had been built for the previous foreman who had moved on to Oregon 2 years ago. It needed some repairs, but it was sturdy and not too far from the main house. "You think she'd accept?" "I think she's too proud to accept charity for long, but honest work and a fair arrangement. Yes, I think she might." Blake nodded slowly. "I'll discuss it with her tomorrow." Mrs. Fairchild smiled, seemingly satisfied. "See that you do. Good night, Mr. Turner." After she left, Blake poured himself another finger of whiskey, considering the proposal. Having Pearl and Emma stay permanently at the ranch made practical sense. He needed a housekeeper's assistant, especially with winter coming on and more men to feed and clothe. The cottage would give Pearl independence while keeping her and Emma close enough for him to ensure their safety. But Blake was honest enough with himself to admit his motivations weren't entirely practical. The thought of Pearl leaving once she was healed had been gnawing at him for days. He wanted her to stay, not just because she needed help, but because in the short time she'd been there, his house had begun to feel more like a home. The next morning, Blake made his proposal to Pearl over breakfast, careful to frame it as a business arrangement rather than charity. "Mrs. Fairchild isn't getting any younger," he explained, watching Pearl's face for her reaction. "She's mentioned needing help for some time now, especially with the mending and laundry. The pay would be fair and the cottage would be part of your compensation." Pearl's brow furrowed as she considered his offer. "It's very generous, but—" "It's not generosity," Blake interrupted gently. "It's practical. You need work and a place to live. I need help running this house properly. The arrangement benefits us both." Pearl glanced down at Emma, who was contentedly exploring a wooden spoon Blake had given her. "The cottage isn't far from here, about a quarter-mile east. It needs some work, but it's solid. You and Emma would be safe there." He leaned forward, his gaze earnest. "I understand if you want to make your own way, Pearl, but at least consider the offer while you heal." After a long moment, Pearl nodded. "I'll think about it, thank you." Blake felt relief wash through him. It wasn't an acceptance, but it wasn't a refusal either. He had time to convince her that staying was the right choice for all of them. As the days passed, Pearl's leg began to heal. Dr. Simmons pronounced the burn less severe than initially feared, though he warned she would likely carry a scar. Pearl found she didn't care about that. She was simply grateful to be alive, with Emma safe and well. She spent more time out of bed each day, first sitting by the window that overlooked Blake's sprawling ranch, then venturing into the hallway and finally downstairs to the parlor. Mrs. Fairchild kept her supplied with mending and sewing projects to pass the time, which Pearl appreciated. She'd never been one for idleness. A week after Blake's proposal, Pearl asked to see the cottage. Though still using a cane, she felt strong enough for the short journey. Blake insisted on driving her in his wagon rather than having her walk the distance. The cottage was indeed small but charming, with 2 bedrooms, a cozy kitchen, and a sitting area with a stone fireplace. It needed cleaning and minor repairs, but Pearl could immediately envision making it a home for herself and Emma. "The roof is new," Blake told her as they explored the interior. "Had it replaced last spring. The chimneys sound too." Pearl ran her hand along the wooden mantel. "It's lovely," she admitted. "Far nicer than my cabin was." Blake watched her carefully. "Then you'll consider staying?" Pearl turned to face him. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd come to know this man, his kindness to his workers, his gentleness with Emma, the quiet strength he carried without arrogance. She'd learned that he'd built his ranch through hard work rather than inheritance, that he read Shakespeare by lamplight after dinner, and that he never failed to remember which of his hands had family waiting for them and made sure they got extra time off to visit. She'd also noticed the way his eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his hand lingered when he helped her down the stairs, the softness in his voice when he spoke to Emma. It would be so easy to stay, to accept the safety and security he offered. But Pearl had learned the hard way that depending too much on anyone was dangerous, even someone as seemingly solid as Blake Turner. "I'm grateful for the opportunity," she said carefully, "but I need to be certain this is a fair business arrangement, not charity disguised as employment." Blake's expression grew serious. "I don't offer charity where respect is due, Pearl. You'd be earning your keep and then some." He gestured to the cottage around them. "This place has stood empty for 2 years. Having someone living here, caring for it, that's worth something to me too." Pearl considered his words. It was a practical solution to her predicament, and the cottage would give her and Emma space and independence while providing security they desperately needed. "All right," she said finally. "We'll stay, at least until I can make other arrangements." Blake's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "I'll have the men start on the repairs today." As they drove back to the main house, Pearl wondered if she was making a mistake. Not because staying at Broken T Ranch was a poor decision, practically speaking, it was ideal. But because with each day that passed, she felt herself drawing closer to Blake Turner in ways that had nothing to do with practical considerations. And that was dangerous territory indeed for a widow with a child and nothing to her name. The cottage was ready for Pearl and Emma to move in by the end of October. Blake had his men working on it whenever they could be spared from ranch duties, replacing broken window panes, fixing squeaky floorboards, and giving the walls a fresh coat of whitewash. Pearl herself had sewn new curtains from fabric Blake purchased in town, and Mrs. Fairchild had helped furnish the small home with items from the main house's attic. On the day Pearl and Emma moved in, Blake brought over a final housewarming gift, a rocking chair he'd had made by a craftsman in Sonora. "Every mother needs a comfortable place to rock her baby," he said, as his men positioned it near the fireplace. "I hope it suits." Pearl ran her hand over the smooth oak, touched beyond words. "It's perfect. Thank you, Blake." She'd started using his first name the week before, at his insistence. It felt both natural and intimate in a way that still made her pulse quicken. As the ranch hands took their leave, Blake lingered. "Will you be all right out here, if you need anything during the night?" Pearl smiled at his concern. "We'll be fine. It's only a quarter mile to the main house if there's an emergency." Blake nodded, though he still looked uncertain. I've asked Miguel to keep the path clear when winter comes. And I've had extra firewood stacked at the back. You've thought of everything, Pearl said, genuinely grateful for his thoroughness. Her leg was healing well, but she still tired easily and relied on the cane when walking any distance. Blake glanced down at Emma, who was exploring her new surroundings with determined crawling. She's growing fast. Too fast, Pearl agreed, watching her daughter pull herself up on a low shelf. She'll be walking before we know it. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by Emma's happy babbling. Pearl was acutely aware of Blake's presence the way he filled the small cottage with his height and breadth. The scent of leather and pine that always seemed to accompany him, the warmth in his hazel eyes when they met hers. I should let you get settled, he said finally, though he made no move to leave. Would you like to stay for supper? Pearl asked impulsively. It's nothing fancy, just stew, but there's plenty. The smile that spread across Blake's face was answer enough. I'd like that very much. That evening marked the beginning of a new pattern. Though Pearl worked at the main house during the day, helping Mrs. Fairchild with household tasks, Blake often came to the cottage for supper 2 or 3 times a week. He always brought something with him, a jar of honey from his beehives, vegetables from the kitchen garden, or a book he thought Pearl might enjoy. November brought colder weather and the first dusting of snow to the foothills. Pearl found herself settling into life at the Broken T with surprising ease. The work was hard but satisfying, and Mrs. Fairchild proved to be both a patient teacher and a good friend. The ranch hands treated her with respect, tipping their hats when they passed her and occasionally bringing small treats for Emma. And then there was Blake. His visits to the cottage had become the highlight of Pearl's days. They would talk for hours after Emma was asleep about books, about the ranch, about their pasts. Pearl told him about growing up in Boston, about meeting Thomas during the war when he was recuperating from a wound in the hospital where she volunteered. Blake shared stories of his childhood in Missouri, his journey west after the war, and his dreams for the ranch. What neither of them spoke about was the growing attraction between them, though Pearl felt it like a living thing whenever they were together. Sometimes she caught Blake watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch, but he never overstepped the boundaries of friendship. Pearl was grateful for his restraint, even as a part of her wished he would be less honorable. It was too soon after Thomas, she reminded herself. Too soon and too complicated with her position as Blake's employee. In early December, Blake announced that he needed to travel to Sacramento on business. I'll be gone for about a week, he told Pearl as they sat by the fire in her cottage. Miguel will oversee the ranch while I'm away, and Mrs. Fairchild knows where to find me if there's any emergency. Pearl felt an unexpected pang at the thought of his absence. Safe travels then, Emma and I will manage just fine. Blake studied her face in the firelight. I've never left the ranch for this long before, not since I bought it. Feels strange. You've built something remarkable here, Pearl said sincerely. But even the most dedicated rancher needs to step away occasionally. Blake smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Perhaps I've asked Sheriff Davis to ride by every couple of days just to check on things. Pearl frowned. Is something wrong? Blake hesitated before answering. Probably not. But there's been talk of Everett Whitmore making some unsavory comments in town about you. Pearl's stomach tightened. She hadn't heard Whitmore's name since the night Blake told her about the fire being deliberate. What kind of comments? The kind that make me reluctant to leave you and Emma alone, Blake said grimly. If I could postpone this trip, I would, but these contracts need to be signed before the new year. We'll be fine, Pearl assured him, though she felt less certain than her words implied. The cottage is secure, and I'm not afraid of Everett Whitmore. Maybe you should be, Blake said quietly. Men like that, men who can't accept rejection, they're dangerous, Pearl. Something in his tone made Pearl wonder if he was speaking from experience, but before she could ask, Emma began fussing in her crib. By the time Pearl had settled her daughter, the moment for such questions had passed. Blake left for Sacramento the next morning, after extracting promises from Pearl that she would keep the doors locked and accept Miguel's offer to escort her to and from the main house each day. Pearl agreed, more to ease Blake's mind than from any real sense of danger. Despite the sheriff's suspicions, there had been no sign of Whitmore or any other trouble since the night of the fire. The first 3 days of Blake's absence passed uneventfully. Pearl missed their evening conversations but kept busy with preparations for Christmas, which was less than 3 weeks away. She was determined to make Emma's first Christmas special despite their modest circumstances. On the 4th day, Pearl was returning to the cottage after finishing her work at the main house. Miguel had offered to walk her home, but she had declined, assuring him she would be fine for the short distance in broad daylight. Emma was with Mrs. Fairchild, who had offered to mind her while Pearl finished hemming curtains for the dining room. The winter afternoon was already growing dim as Pearl approached the cottage. Something about the shadows around the building made her slow her steps. The door which she was certain she had closed that morning stood slightly ajar. Pearl halted, her heart beginning to race. She glanced back toward the main house, wondering if she should return and ask for help, but what if she was simply being foolish? Perhaps Miguel or one of the other hands had stopped by to check on the cottage, as Blake had instructed them to do. Gathering her courage, Pearl approached cautiously, her hand tightening on her cane, which now served as much for security as for support. "Hello," she called. "Is someone there?" Silence greeted her. Taking a deep breath, Pearl pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The cottage looked just as she had left it that morning, neat and orderly, with Emma's toys tidied away in their basket by the fireplace. But as Pearl moved further into the room, she noticed that the drawer of her small writing desk was open, papers scattered across its surface. Someone had been searching through her things. Pearl backed toward the door, suddenly certain she shouldn't be there alone. But before she could flee, a figure stepped out from the shadows of the bedroom doorway. "Mrs. Nelson," Everett Whitmore said, his voice deceptively pleasant. "How convenient, I was just looking for you." Pearl's blood ran cold at the sight of the banker's son. Tall and lean, with pale blonde hair and cold blue eyes, Whitmore had the appearance of gentility that masked a cruel nature. Pearl had learned that truth the hard way when he'd cornered her behind the general store last spring, his courtship turning to threats when she'd rejected his advances. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "you're trespassing. Please leave my home immediately." Whitmore's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Your home? I was under the impression this cottage belonged to Blake Turner." He glanced around with exaggerated interest. "Cozy little arrangement you've made for yourself. The whole town is talking about it." Pearl stood her ground, though her hand trembled on the cane. "What I do is none of your concern. Now please leave before I call for help." Whitmore stepped closer and Pearl caught the scent of whiskey on his breath. "There's no one to hear you, Pearl. Turner's men are all at the north pasture. I made sure of that before I came." Fear shot through Pearl's veins, but she refused to show it. "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted," Whitmore said, his voice hardening. But you were too good for me, weren't you? Too loyal to your dead husband's memory." His face twisted with contempt. "Until Turner came along, what did he offer you that I couldn't? Money, protection, or just a warm bed?" Pearl's fear gave way to anger. "You know nothing about me or Mr. Turner. Now get out." She raised her cane defensively as Whitmore lunged toward her. In the struggle that followed, Pearl fought with all her strength, driven by thoughts of Emma and the life they were building at the Broken Tea. But Whitmore was stronger, fueled by alcohol and rage. A sharp crack echoed through the cottage as Whitmore struck Pearl across the face. She fell back against the writing desk, pain exploding through her injured leg. Through blurred vision, she saw Whitmore reaching for her again. Then suddenly, the front door burst open with such force that it splintered against the wall. Miguel stood in the doorway, shotgun raised. "Step away from her," the foreman ordered, his voice deadly calm. "Now." Whitmore froze, his face contorting with rage and fear. "This is none of your business, Mexican." Miguel's expression didn't change as he cocked the shotgun. "Mrs. Nelson works for the Broken Tea. That makes her safety my business." He gestured with the gun. "Outside, now." For a moment, Pearl thought Whitmore might resist. Then, with a last venomous glance at her, he stalked past Miguel and out the door. "This isn't over," he spat as he passed. Miguel kept the shotgun trained on Whitmore until he mounted his horse and rode away. Only then did he lower the weapon and turn to Pearl. "Are you hurt, Senora?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Pearl touched her cheek, which was already beginning to swell. "Nothing serious. How did you know?" "I saw his horse tied in the trees when I was riding back from the north pasture." Miguel's expression darkened. "I should have shot him." "No," Pearl said quickly. "No more violence. I just want him gone." Miguel nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "You should not stay here alone tonight. I will send one of the men to ride for the sheriff, and you will come to the main house." Too shaken to argue, Pearl allowed Miguel to escort her back to Mrs. Fairchild, who exclaimed in horror at the sight of Pearl's bruised face. The housekeeper settled Pearl and Emma in Blake's study, insisting they would stay at the main house until Blake returned. "That despicable man, Mrs. Fairchild fumed as she applied a cold compress to Pearl's cheek. "Sheriff Davis should have run him out of town months ago. Everyone knows he's trouble." Pearl held Emma close, the baby's solid warmth reassuring her that they were safe. "I should have been more careful. Blake warned me, Mrs. Fairchild's expression softened. "Mr. Turner will be beside himself when he hears what happened. He cares for you and little Emma very much, you know." Pearl closed her eyes, too exhausted to deny what had become increasingly obvious to everyone at the Broken T. "I know," she whispered. Sheriff Davis arrived an hour later, his weathered face grave as Pearl recounted her confrontation with Whitmore. The sheriff took detailed notes, asking occasional questions about Whitmore's statements and actions. "I'll ride out to the Whitmore place tonight," he said when Pearl had finished. "Everett's gone too far this time. His father's influence won't protect him from assault charges." "Will that be enough to keep him away?" Pearl asked, voicing her deepest fear. He seemed unhinged. The sheriff's expression was grim. "I'll make sure he understands the consequences if he comes near you again. In the meantime, I suggest you stay at the main house, as Mrs. Fairchild has arranged." After the sheriff left, Pearl tried to settle in Blake's study, which Mrs. Fairchild had prepared for her and Emma. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Whitmore's face twisted with rage. Worse, she couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if Miguel hadn't arrived when he did. Pearl glanced down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in the makeshift crib the ranch hands had brought in from the cottage. Her daughter deserved better than a life shadowed by fear. Perhaps it would be best to leave Jamestown altogether once Blake returned. The thought of leaving the Broken T, of leaving Blake, sent an unexpected pang through Pearl's heart. In the months since the fire, she had built a life here, found purpose and security. And despite her best efforts to maintain emotional distance, she had fallen in love with the quiet, honorable rancher who had saved them from the flames. But love wasn't always enough, not when it put her child at risk. With these troubled thoughts, Pearl finally drifted into uneasy sleep, unaware that a rider was already galloping toward Sacramento with news that would bring Blake Turner home much sooner than expected. Blake pushed his horse harder than was wise on the mountain trails, but urgency drove him. Miguel's message had reached him in Sacramento just as he was concluding his business, the words burning into his brain. "Whitmore attacked Mrs. Nelson. She is safe but shaken. Sheriff involved." The brief note told him nothing of Pearl's injuries or state of mind, only that she and Emma were being kept safe at the main house. It was enough to send Blake riding out immediately, despite the late hour and the gathering storm clouds. He'd been a fool to leave them. Even with Miguel and the other hands watching over the ranch, Blake should have known Whitmore wouldn't be deterred by mere distance. The man's obsession with Pearl had been evident in the rumors Blake had heard in town, in the calculated way he spoke about her whenever Blake was within earshot. Blake had warned Pearl, but he hadn't taken his own warnings seriously enough. He should have dealt with Whitmore directly before leaving for Sacramento. Should have made it unmistakably clear that any threat to Pearl or Emma would be met with the full force of Blake's considerable influence in the county. Now Pearl had paid the price for his hesitation. Rain began to fall as Blake crossed into familiar territory, the droplets turning to sleet that stung his face and hands. He barely noticed the discomfort, his mind fixed on reaching the ranch, on seeing for himself that Pearl and Emma were truly safe. It was well past midnight when Blake finally rode into the yard of the Broken T. Despite the late hour, lights still burned in several windows of the main house. Miguel emerged from the bunkhouse as Blake dismounted, his expression relieved. "Senor Turner, we did not expect you until tomorrow at the earliest." "I rode straight through," Blake said, handing the reins to his foreman. "How is she?" Miguel's face darkened. "Whitmore struck her. Her face is bruised, but Dr. Simmons says there is no serious damage." "The senora is more frightened than hurt, I think." Blake's hands clenched involuntarily. "And Whitmore? Sheriff Davis arrested him yesterday. His father came with money for bail, but the sheriff refused." Miguel's satisfaction was evident. "He sits in the jail until the judge arrives next week." At least there was that small comfort. Blake nodded his thanks to Miguel and strode toward the house, pausing only to scrape the worst of the mud from his boots before entering. Mrs. Fairchild met him in the foyer, still dressed despite the late hour. "Thank goodness you've returned," she said in a hushed voice. "She's been asking for you since it happened." "Where is she?" Blake asked, already moving toward the stairs. "In your study," Mrs. Fairchild replied. "I made up a bed for her and the baby there. She didn't want to be upstairs alone." Blake changed direction, moving quietly toward the study door, which stood slightly ajar. He pushed it open carefully, not wanting to wake Emma if she was sleeping. The fire had burned low in the grate, casting the room in soft, flickering shadows. Pearl sat in his leather chair by the hearth, Emma asleep in her arms. She looked up as the door opened, her eyes widening at the sight of him. "Blake," she breathed, her voice a mixture of surprise and relief. "You're back early." Blake crossed the room in a few long strides, dropping to one knee beside the chair. In the firelight, he could see the dark bruise that marred Pearl's left cheekbone, the split in her lower lip. Rage and tenderness warred within him as he gently touched her uninjured cheek. "I should never have left," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Pearl shook her head. "This wasn't your fault." Whitmore was determined. If not yesterday, he would have found another opportunity. "Tell me what happened," Blake said. "Everything." As Pearl recounted the confrontation at the cottage, Blake's anger toward Whitmore grew, but so did his admiration for Pearl's courage. She had faced her attacker with the same determination she'd shown the night of the fire, protecting herself as best she could until help arrived. "Miguel says the sheriff has him in jail," Blake said when she finished. Pearl nodded. "Until the circuit judge arrives, but his father was at the sheriff's office this morning arguing for his release. I don't know if he won't get out," Blake interrupted firmly. "I'll make sure of it." Pearl studied his face, her green eyes troubled. "And when the judge comes, what then? A fine, a few weeks in jail, he'll be free eventually, Blake." The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Blake knew she was right. The law could only do so much, especially against a man from a wealthy family like the Whitmores. "We'll deal with that when the time comes," Blake said, though his mind was already turning over possibilities. "For now, you and Emma are staying here in the main house." No arguments. To his surprise, Pearl didn't protest. "All right," she agreed quietly. Blake took Emma from Pearl's arms, settling the sleeping baby in the makeshift crib nearby. Then he pulled another chair close to Pearl's, taking her hands in his. They were cold despite the fire's warmth, and he rubbed them gently between his own. "I was so afraid when I got Miguel's message," he admitted, his voice low. "All I could think about was getting back to you and Emma." Pearl's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I was afraid too. Not just of Whitmore, but of what his actions might mean for our future here." "Your future at the Broken T is secure," Blake assured her. "No one, not Whitmore, not anyone, is going to drive you away from your home." Pearl's breath caught at the possessiveness in his tone. "Blake, no, let me finish," he interrupted, needing to say what he had been holding back for weeks. "I know this isn't the right time. I know you're still healing from the fire, from this attack, from losing your husband. But I can't pretend anymore, Pearl. I care for you deeply." "You and Emma both." Pearl's fingers tightened around his. "Blake, we work for you. It wouldn't be proper." Hang propriety, Blake said with unexpected vehemence. You've never really worked for me, Pearl. You've been a guest from the start, whatever fiction we created to protect your pride. A small smile touched Pearl's lips despite the seriousness of the moment. My pride, your fierce, beautiful independence, Blake clarified, a matching smile briefly lighting his features. It's one of the many things I admire about you. Pearl's expression grew solemn again. What are you saying, Blake? Blake took a deep breath, knowing he was about to change everything between them. I'm saying that I love you, Pearl Nelson. I think I've loved you since that first night when I found you protecting Emma with your own body despite your injuries. Tears spilled onto Pearl's cheeks. Blake, I am a widow with a child and nothing to my name. You have everything I could ever want, Blake interrupted gently. Courage, compassion, strength, and you have Emma, who has somehow wound her way around my heart as surely as her mother has. Pearl's free hand came up to touch his face, her touch tentative, as if she couldn't quite believe this was real. I never expected to feel this way again, she whispered. After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over. And now? Blake prompted, his heart pounding as he waited for her answer. Now I find myself falling in love with a man who carried my baby and me from a burning building and told us we were safe. A tremulous smile curved Pearl's lips, and we have been, Blake, safe and cared for and loved. Blake's restraint finally broke. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them to capture her lips in a gentle kiss, mindful of her injured lip. Pearl responded with a soft sigh, her hand sliding around to the back of his neck as the kiss deepened. When they finally parted, both breathless, Blake rested his forehead against Pearl's. Stay with me, he whispered. Not as my housekeeper or tenant, as my wife. Let me be a father to Emma. Pearl drew back slightly, searching his face. Are you certain there will be talk? People will say you married beneath you, that I trapped you somehow. Let them talk, Blake said firmly. Anyone who matters knows the truth, that I'm the lucky one to have found you. Emma stirred in her sleep, drawing their attention. Pearl looked from her daughter to Blake, love and hope warring with lingering fear in her eyes. What about Whitmore? She asked softly. Even if the judge sentences him, he won't be in jail forever. Blake's expression hardened. I've been thinking about that. How would you feel about a fresh start? I have family in Oregon with land to sell, good ranching country near a growing town. Pearl looked startled. You would leave the broken tea after all you've built here? I would build again, Blake said simply, with you and Emma. The ranch is just land and buildings, Pearl. You two are what matter now. Fresh tears filled Pearl's eyes at his declaration. I don't want you to give up your home because of my troubles. It wouldn't be giving up anything, Blake assured her, drawing her closer. It would be gaining everything that truly matters. As if sensing the significance of the moment, Emma woke with a small cry. Pearl moved to rise, but Blake gently pressed her back into the chair. Let me, he said, crossing to lift the baby into his arms. Emma's cries immediately subsided as Blake settled her against his chest, her tiny hand clutching at his shirt. The sight of them together, this strong man cradling her child with such tenderness, made Pearl's decision clear. Yes, she said softly. Blake turned, his expression questioning. Yes. Yes, I'll marry you. Pearl's voice grew stronger with certainty. And yes to Oregon if that's what's best for our family. Blake crossed back to her, Emma still in his arms, and knelt beside Pearl's chair. Our family, he repeated, the words filled with wonder and promise. I like the sound of that. As Blake sealed their engagement with another kiss, Pearl felt the last of her doubts fade away. They still faced challenges: Whitmore's trial, the potential move to Oregon, building a new life together. But for the first time since the night of the fire, Pearl felt something beyond mere safety or security. She felt hope. And love. And the certainty that, with Blake and Emma, she had found her true home. The news of Blake and Pearl's engagement spread quickly through Jamestown. Most reactions were positive. The ranch hands had grown fond of Pearl and Emma, and anyone who knew Blake could see how much happier he'd been since they came into his life. Sheriff Davis was particularly pleased when Blake informed him of their plans to marry. About time you settled down, Turner, he said with a knowing grin. And Mrs. Nelson is a fine woman. You're lucky she'll have you. Don't I know it? Blake agreed, his expression softening at the mention of Pearl. The sheriff's expression grew more serious. I heard you're considering selling the ranch. That true? Blake nodded. I've been in contact with my cousin in Oregon. He says there's good land available near Salem. The sheriff studied him thoughtfully. This have anything to do with Whitmore? Partly, Blake admitted. The judge sentenced him to 6 months, but that's not long enough for my peace of mind. His obsession with Pearl seems dangerous. Can't say I blame you for wanting a fresh start, the sheriff conceded. Though we'll miss you around here, you've been good for this community. We haven't made any final decisions yet, Blake said, though in truth, he was already corresponding with potential buyers for the Broken Tea. But I appreciate your understanding. Meanwhile, preparations for the wedding proceeded quickly. Blake and Pearl had agreed on a small ceremony just after Christmas, with only their closest friends in attendance. Mrs. Fairchild took charge of the arrangements, declaring that the main house would be decorated fit for royalty for the occasion. Pearl divided her time between wedding preparations and making the main house truly her own. Blake had insisted she move out of the guest room and into the master suite, though they maintained separate bedrooms until after the wedding, a concession to propriety that amused them both, given how little they cared for town gossip. Emma thrived amid all the activity, crawling everywhere and pulling herself up on furniture. Her first steps came just a week before Christmas, tottering from the sofa to Blake's outstretched arms as Pearl watched with happy tears. She's growing so fast, Pearl said that evening as they sat by the fire, Emma asleep between them on a blanket. Blake smiled, reaching across to take Pearl's hand. Soon she'll have brothers and sisters to chase after. Pearl's cheeks flushed at his words. They had spoken of having more children, building the family neither of them had fully experienced growing up. Pearl as an only child whose parents had died before she was 20, Blake with just one brother who lived far away. I'd like that, she said softly. Emma would be a wonderful big sister. Their peaceful moment was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Blake frowned. It was past 8, late for casual visitors, especially in winter. Stay here, he told Pearl, rising to answer the door. Pearl gathered Emma into her arms, suddenly anxious. Though Whitmore remained securely in jail, the memory of his attack was still fresh. She relaxed slightly when she heard Miguel's voice in the hallway, followed by Blake's deeper tones in conversation. Blake returned to the parlor with a troubled expression, Miguel following behind. What's wrong? Pearl asked, immediately alert to the tension between the men. Blake glanced at Miguel before answering. There was a fire in town, the jail. Pearl's blood ran cold. Whitmore escaped, Blake confirmed grimly. Along with 2 other prisoners, the sheriff has a posse forming now. Senor, Miguel said, his expression grave, the men are ready. We should join the search. Blake nodded, already moving toward the gun cabinet. Tell them to saddle my horse. I'll be out in 5 minutes. As Miguel left to relay the instructions, Pearl stood, clutching Emma tighter. You think he'll come here? It wasn't a question, but Blake answered anyway. I think we need to be prepared for that possibility. Whitmore knows I'm often out with the herd this time of year. He might assume you're alone at the cottage. Fear and determination warred within Pearl. What should I do? Blake loaded his rifle with swift, practiced movements. Stay here in the house. Mrs. Fairchild is already upstairs. I've asked her to remain with you. Keep the doors locked. I'm leaving 2 men behind to watch the property. Pearl nodded, forcing herself to remain calm for Emma's sake. How long will you be gone? Not long, Blake promised, crossing to her side. He cupped her face gently, his eyes intense. I'm not letting him anywhere near you or Emma again, Pearl. I swear it. Pearl leaned into his touch. Be careful, please. Blake pressed a fierce kiss to her lips. Always. He bent to kiss Emma's forehead before straightening, his expression resolute. Lock the door behind me. After Blake left, Pearl did as instructed, checking every window and door in the house before settling in the parlor with Mrs. Fairchild. Emma, sensing the tension, fussed until Pearl sang her to sleep with soft lullabies. Try to rest, dear, Mrs. Fairchild urged as the hours crept by. The men won't let anyone near the house. But Pearl couldn't relax, her mind filled with terrible possibilities. What if Whitmore evaded the posse? What if Blake was injured in the search? What if a sound from the back of the house interrupted her spiraling thoughts? Pearl exchanged alarmed glances with Mrs. Fairchild. "That came from the kitchen," the housekeeper whispered. Pearl set Emma on the sofa, tucked securely between cushions, and reached for the shotgun Blake had left by the parlor door. "Stay with Emma," she instructed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Pearl, no," Mrs. Fairchild protested. "Blake said to stay together." "And I'm not letting anyone get close enough to threaten either of you," Pearl replied, her grip tightening on the weapon. Moving quietly through the dining room toward the kitchen, Pearl strained to hear over the pounding of her heart. Another sound, the scrape of a boot on tile. Someone was definitely in the kitchen. Pearl braced the shotgun against her shoulder the way Blake had taught her, aiming at the kitchen door as it slowly swung open. "Stop right there," she commanded, her finger tensing on the trigger. Everett Whitmore stepped into view, his face illuminated by the single lamp Pearl had left burning in the dining room. He looked haggard, his once immaculate clothes dirty and torn, his face gaunt from his time in jail. "Hello, Pearl," he said, as if they were meeting at a social gathering rather than in the middle of the night with a shotgun between them. "I see Turner has left you all alone again. Careless of him." "Blake and the sheriff are searching for you right now," Pearl said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You won't get far." Whitmore's smile was cold. "Far enough after I finish here." He took a step forward. "You should have chosen me, Pearl. We could have had a good life together." "Don't come any closer," Pearl warned, the shotgun unwavering in her hands. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "You won't shoot me, you don't have it in you. To protect my daughter and myself, try me." Pearl's voice was steel. Something in her tone must have convinced him, because Whitmore halted his advance. "It doesn't have to be this way, Pearl. Put down the gun, come with me willingly. I have horses waiting and contacts in San Francisco. We could be gone before Turner even returns." Pearl almost laughed at the absurdity of his proposal. "I'm marrying Blake in a week, Everett. I love him. I have never and will never have any interest in you. Your obsession has already cost you your freedom and your reputation. Don't let it cost you your life, too." Whitmore's face contorted with rage. "You think I'll let Turner have you after everything?" His hand moved to his waistband, where Pearl could now see a pistol tucked. "Mrs. Nelson," came a call from outside. "Everything all right in there?" One of the ranch hands Blake had left behind. Relief flooded through Pearl, but she kept her focus on Whitmore, whose expression had turned calculating. "Answer him," he hissed. "Tell him everything's fine or I start shooting." Pearl raised her voice. "We have an intruder. Whitmore is in the house." Whitmore lunged for his gun, but Pearl was faster. The shotgun blast was deafening in the confined space, the force of it knocking Pearl back a step. Whitmore crumpled to the floor with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder. The back door burst open as Blake's men rushed in, rifles ready. They quickly secured Whitmore, who was moaning and cursing but very much alive. "Are you hurt, Mrs. Nelson?" one of the hands asked, eyeing the shotgun still gripped in Pearl's shaking hands. "No," Pearl managed, though she felt as if her legs might give way beneath her. "No, I'm fine." The sound of more horses approaching sent one of the men to the window. "It's the boss," he reported with evident relief. "And the sheriff." The next few minutes passed in a blur as Blake burst into the house, taking in the scene with a single glance before crossing to Pearl and enfolding her in his arms. She let the shotgun drop, clinging to him as the reality of what had just happened washed over her. "Emma," Blake asked urgently. "With Mrs. Fairchild in the parlor," Pearl assured him. "She's safe." Blake's arms tightened around her. "And you, he didn't hurt you." Pearl shook her head against his chest. "I had the shotgun. I shot him before he could draw on me." Blake pulled back just enough to see her face, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. "You protected our home, our family," Pearl repeated, drawing strength from the words. "Yes." The sheriff and his deputies took Whitmore away, promising he would be transported to the state prison in San Quentin as soon as his wound was treated. This time, there would be no local jail to escape from, no influential father to plead for leniency. Later, after the excitement had died down and Emma had been settled back in her crib, Pearl and Blake sat together on the porch swing, a blanket wrapped around their shoulders against the December chill. "I've been thinking," Blake said, his arm secure around Pearl's waist. "Maybe we don't need to sell the ranch after all." Pearl looked up at him in surprise. "But I thought you'd already started negotiations." "Nothing's final yet," Blake said, "and after tonight I realized something. We're stronger here together than we would be starting over somewhere new." Pearl considered his words. "You're not worried about Whitmore anymore. He's going to be in San Quentin for a very long time," Blake said confidently. "And everyone in the county knows now what happens to men who threaten the Turner family." There was unmistakable pride in his voice as he added, "My brave wife to be saw to that." Pearl smiled at the endearment, settling more comfortably against Blake's side. "I do love the broken tea," she admitted. "It's become home in a way I never expected." "Then we'll stay," Blake decided, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Build our family here, watch Emma grow up riding these pastures and climbing these hills. And fill the house with brothers and sisters for her," Pearl added softly. Blake's arm tightened around her. "Starting with the one you're carrying now," Pearl pulled back in shock. "What? How did you? I only just began to suspect myself." Blake's smile was tender. "You've been tired lately, and Mrs. Fairchild mentioned you couldn't stomach coffee at breakfast anymore." His hand moved to rest gently over her still flat stomach. "Our child is growing in there, a new beginning." Tears of happiness filled Pearl's eyes as she covered his hand with her own. "A new beginning," she agreed, "but the same home, the same love." Blake leaned down to kiss her, a promise and a pledge in the gentle press of his lips. "Always," he murmured against her mouth. "Always." Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, with a fresh dusting of snow transforming the broken tea into a winter wonderland. Pearl woke early, excitement bubbling through her veins. Not only was it Emma's first Christmas, but in just 2 days, Pearl would become Blake Turner's wife. Blake was already awake, standing by the window of the master bedroom that would soon be theirs to share. He turned at the sound of her stirring, a smile spreading across his face. "Merry Christmas," he said, crossing to sit beside her on the bed. "How are my girls this morning?" Pearl's hand drifted to her stomach, a gesture that had already become habit in the week since she'd confirmed her pregnancy. "We're perfect," she replied, leaning up for a kiss, "especially since Santa has come and gone," Blake chuckled. "I may have gotten a bit carried away with Emma's presence." "A bit," Pearl teased. "The entire parlor is overflowing." "She deserves it," Blake said, unrepentant. "And so do you." Before Pearl could respond, a cry from the adjoining nursery announced that Emma was awake and ready to discover the wonders of her first Christmas. The day passed in a blur of joy and celebration. Emma was more interested in the colorful paper and ribbons than the gifts themselves, but she squealed with delight at the rocking horse Blake had commissioned from a craftsman in Sonora. Pearl was moved to tears by Blake's gift to her, a beautiful gold locket containing miniature portraits of Thomas on one side and Blake on the other. "So our child will know both the father who gave him life and the father who will raise him," Blake explained as he fastened it around her neck. "Him?" Pearl questioned with a smile. "So certain it's a boy," Blake shrugged, his eyes twinkling. "Boy or girl doesn't matter, as long as the baby has your spirit and determination." Pearl's gift to Blake was more modest, but no less meaningful, a hand-embroidered handkerchief bearing his initials and a small family portrait she had worked on in secret, showing Blake with Pearl and Emma. "It's not much," she began, but Blake silenced her with a kiss. "It's everything," he corrected her. "My family, there's no greater gift." The day concluded with a festive dinner attended by the ranch hands, Mrs. Fairchild, and a few close friends from town. As Pearl looked around the table at the faces of those who had become so dear to her in such a short time, she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced since leaving Boston. This was home. These people were family. And the man at the head of the table, who caught her eye and smiled with such love it made her breath catch, was the center of it all. 2 days later, on December 27, 1876, Pearl Nelson became Pearl Turner in a simple ceremony held in the parlor of the Broken T Ranch. Emma, dressed in a tiny white dress sewn by Mrs. Fairchild, was held by Miguel, who had been honored to serve as Blake's best man. Pearl wore a gown of deep blue velvet that Blake had ordered from Sacramento, with her mother's lace veil and the gold locket Blake had given her for Christmas. As she spoke her vows, her voice clear and unwavering, Pearl felt the rightness of this moment, this joining of her life with Blake's. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." Blake gathered Pearl into his arms, his kiss a tender promise of all the years to come. When they turned to face their small gathering of guests, Emma reached for them from Miguel's arms, clearly unwilling to be left out of the celebration. Laughter filled the room as Blake took his daughter, now officially his by law as well as love, and held her between himself and Pearl. "The Turner family," he announced proudly, "complete at last, but it was only the beginning." As the winter snow melted into spring, Pearl's pregnancy progressed, her body blossoming with new life. Emma took her first confident steps, then began running everywhere, keeping Blake and Pearl constantly on their toes. The ranch thrived under Blake's careful management, with Pearl increasingly involved in the business side of operations. By summer, they had expanded the main house, adding a proper nursery adjacent to their bedroom and converting Blake's study into a combination library and schoolroom for Emma and future children. Planning ahead, Pearl teased as Blake installed bookshelves along one wall. "A Turner is always prepared," he replied with a wink. "Besides, our children will need to be educated if they are to run this ranch someday. Our children." The words still filled Pearl with wonder and gratitude. From the desperate night of the fire to this peaceful summer day, her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. On a warm September evening, as the first hints of autumn tinged the air, Pearl felt the first contractions begin. Blake, who had barely left her side in the final weeks of her pregnancy, sent for the midwife immediately. "Everything will be fine," he assured Pearl as he helped her to their bed. "You're the strongest woman I know." Pearl gripped his hand through the pain of the next contraction. "Don't leave," she whispered. "Never," Blake promised. Not for a moment, true to his word, Blake remained with Pearl through the long hours of labor, contrary to custom but unwilling to leave her to face this challenge alone. Emma was safely in Mrs. Fairchild's care, and the ranch hands had been warned to expect their boss to be unavailable until further notice. As dawn broke over the eastern hills, Pearl gave birth to a healthy baby boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's hazel eyes. "He's perfect," Blake whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he held his son for the first time. "Pearl, he's absolutely perfect." "Thomas Blake Turner," Pearl said softly, honoring both her first husband's memory and the man who had brought her back from the brink of despair. "Our son." Blake carefully placed the newborn in Pearl's arms, then sat beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders as they gazed down at their child. "Our son," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our family." Emma was brought in to meet her brother later that morning, her curiosity evident as she peered at the tiny bundle in her mother's arms. "Baby?" she asked, pointing. "Yes, sweetheart," Pearl confirmed. "This is your brother, Thomas." Emma considered this information solemnly before pronouncing, "My baby," with such certainty that both Pearl and Blake laughed. "She's already protective," Blake observed. "Like her mother." Pearl leaned against his solid strength, contentment washing over her despite her exhaustion. "Like both her parents," she corrected. "We protect what we love." As the years passed, the Turner family continued to grow and thrive. Emma developed into a spirited young girl with her mother's auburn hair and determination. Thomas, called Tommy by everyone except his grandfather in Sacramento, inherited his father's calm temperament and love for the land. They were joined by a sister, Lily, 2 years later, and another brother, James, the year after that. The Broken T expanded as well, with Blake purchasing adjoining properties when they became available. By 1885, it was one of the largest and most prosperous ranches in the county, known for its quality cattle and fair treatment of workers. Pearl never forgot the night of the fire that had changed her life's trajectory. Each year on the anniversary, she and Blake would walk to the hilltop overlooking their property, where they could see for miles in every direction the pastures, the orchards they'd planted, the creek where their children learned to swim, and the main house, expanded now to accommodate their growing family. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't been riding by that night?" Pearl asked on one such anniversary, her hand securely in Blake's. Blake considered the question, his gaze on the distant horizon where the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. "I think some things are meant to be, Pearl, if not that night, then another. Our paths were destined to cross." Pearl smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. At 32, she was still as beautiful to him as she had been that first night, though motherhood and ranch life had added character to her face and silver threads to her auburn hair. "Such a romantic," she teased. "Who would have guessed that beneath that stoic rancher exterior beat the heart of a poet?" Blake laughed, pulling her closer. "Only you would know, Mrs. Turner, only you," as they walked back to the house where their children waited with Mrs. Fairchild, now well into her 70s, but still an integral part of the household. Pearl reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From the desperate flight from a burning cabin, to the terrifying confrontation with Whitmore, to the joyful births of their children, every moment had led to this life they'd built together. "You know," Blake said as they approached the house, warm light spilling from its windows into the gathering dusk, "I still remember what I told you that first night when I found you and Emma outside your burning cabin." Pearl smiled up at him. "You said we were both safe." Blake stopped, turning to face her fully, his hands cupping her face with the same tenderness he'd shown for 10 years of marriage. "And you are," he said softly, "you always will be as long as I'm drawing breath." "I know," Pearl replied, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. "That's why I fell in love with you, Blake Turner. Because from that very first moment, you made me believe in safety again, in home, in family." Blake's arms enfolded her, strong and secure as they had been since the night he'd carried her and Emma from danger. "And you taught me what it means to truly live, Pearl. To love without reservation, to build something that will outlast us both." As they entered their home, greeted by the happy clamor of their children and the rich aroma of dinner cooking, Pearl felt the familiar wave of gratitude that never failed to overwhelm her at moments like these. From the ashes of tragedy, she and Blake had built something beautiful, a love that had not only saved her and Emma on that desperate night, but had gone on to create a legacy of joy, strength, and enduring commitment. In the warmth of their home, surrounded by the family they had built together, Pearl and Blake Turner found the fulfillment of the promise made on that fateful night in 1876. "You're both safe." Now and always they were home.